type of ship that would have been built in this Navy Yard here at Charlestown between 1942 and 1944. And there were 14 Fletcher-class destroyers built here during those years. In addition, destroyer escorts and LSTs, landing ship tanks, were also constructed in this section of Boston Navy Yard. As we move away from Charlestown, we'll be passing by former naval annexes in Chelsea and East Boston, where small ship repair were conducted. There would have also been a base for anti-submarine warfare craft known as subchasers, and an anti-submarine warfare training school. And finally, we'll be passing by the massive naval annex in South Boston, where the Navy could make repairs to any ship the Allies had during the Second World War. We're leaving Pier 1 now. We're passing by USS Casa on our left. Adjacent to Casa, Dry Dock number 1, one of the oldest dry docks in the country. We'll be passing that in just a moment. It's just before the dilapidated Pier number 2, which hopefully will be repaired in the near future. Dry docks allowed ships to sail in. A caisson or a gate would be used to seal the dry dock off from the harbor, and then the water would be pumped out so hull repairs could be effected. Some of the earliest buildings of the Navy Yard, the granite structures that you see would have been erected in the 1830s. It's a pump house and ship fitters and sail loft. Again, to our left, we're going to be passing by another landmark in the Navy Yard, that is Dry Dock number 2, which does not have its caisson, so it is open to the harbor. But in that dry dock during the Second World War, 4 ships could be constructed at one time. We're now passing, or getting ready to pass Pier 4. Imagine the hulls of ships that have been launched, waiting for their superstructures, meaning their deck structures and funnels or smokestacks, as well as armament. In the summer of 1943, we would have found 38 ships under construction at the same time. The large building to our left is today referred to as Admiral's Wharf. The 2 wings closest to the harbor were added in the 1980s, where it was converted into condominiums. 2 floors were added to the top. That would have been the electrics building. This is where radios, sonar, other electrical equipment would have been repaired or fabricated here in the yard. The empty pier is Pier 5. Again, imagine ships tied up here waiting for deck structures and armament. The building with the arch, skylights at the top, is Building 42. It was erected in the 1850s. And in that structure and adjacent structures that were later added, you would have had foundries, pipe fitter shops. You would have had a 1 million volt radar, the first in the world, that would have checked out welds on hull plates of the various parts of a ship. Now we come to the former site of the shipbuilding ways. There were 3 inclined ramps where ships would have their keels laid, and slowly but surely construction would take place on them until their hulls were finished, and then they would be launched into the harbor. Where the gray apartment buildings are today, it's Pier 6. It would have been adjacent to the shipbuilding ways. Where you see the green trees and the modern condominiums, that would have been the shipbuilding ways. Rising above them would be massive cranes, gantry cranes that would have been stationary. Just the crane arm itself would pivot. Around the Navy Yard, there would have been dozens of locomotive cranes and larger cranes than you would have seen, that you saw at Pier 1. Navy Yard had specialized in building destroyers beginning in 1932, and that's the point where there was so adept at their construction, they could build 2 or 4 simultaneously, next door to one another. Walk in the halls would proceed at an even pace. Launch days were often Sundays. The modern building is directly in front of us would have been Building 104, the steel fabrication shop, where the components of the ship's hull and superstructure would have been formed. Massive tools to bend or to put curves in steel in this former shop building, which was torn down in the early 1980s. Only a small portion of Building 104 remains. The large warehouse that rises behind the brick buildings that you see, the concrete and brick structure with the air conditioning units on top. 2 massive storehouses, one built during the First World War, the second just prior to the Second World War. This would have housed all the supplies a ship and its crew would need. We're now passing by Yard 10 and Pier 10 and what remains of Dry Dock number 5. Dry Docks number 3 and 4 are the South Boston Naval Annex. Now just ahead of us, below the Turbine Bridge, you may see a low raised structure. That is part of Chelsea Naval Hospital. It is the oldest naval hospital building in the country. The second oldest naval hospital in the United States. At one time there would have been a swing bridge, low to the water, that would have connected Charlestown with Chelsea. So shipyard workers and naval personnel could easily move from the Charlestown Yard to the Chelsea Naval Hospital. Just up the Chelsea Creek, which runs between Chelsea and East Boston, you would have had the massive naval fuel depot that was connected by pipeline to Deepwater Fuel Pier in East Boston. On our left now, we're passing by Border Street in East Boston, what remains of civilian docks. The Atlantic Works Shipyard, which was owned by Bethlehem Steel, whose headquarters were at the Four Rivers Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. It's hard to imagine that at one time this waterfront was a major shipbuilding center and ship repair center. Many of the neighborhood buildings that would have been warehouses facing the waterfront have been torn down for these new condominiums and apartments that you see building. East Boston would have been the port of entry for immigrants here in Boston. Boston was second only to New York as a port of entry for immigrants to the United States in the early 20th century. Along the East Boston waterfront would have been international shipping terminals. And towering above these piers would have been massive grain elevators, like the Grand Union grain elevator that would have stored grain from the heartland of the United States. Throughout the course of the Second World War, Boston and other East Coast ports were helping to keep England and Russia and our allies in the fight by sending over provisions and supplies for the civilian population as well as for their military. The U-boat menaced the Atlantic, which had sunk thousands of ships by 1942. It was nearly won by Nazi Germany in early 1943. As England had been left with just 3 months of fuel after devastating shipping losses across the Atlantic in 1942. It's hard to imagine today many of the merchant ships that would have been tied up at the East Boston wharves would depart for the perilous North Atlantic run, escorted by destroyers and destroyer escorts, another ship that Boston specialized in building. And despite the best precautions of the Allied navies guarding these merchant vessels, keeping the lifelines open to our allies in Britain and in Russia, many of these ships were lost to German U-boats. Now the high-rise that's to our left stands at the site of Lockwood's Basin, which would have been part of the East Boston Naval Annexes, the site of the Anti-Submarine Warfare School, and the Anti-Submarine Inshore Patrol. These would have been small sub-chasers, patrol craft, that would have cruised through Massachusetts Bay and the Gulf of Maine looking for enemy U-boats. The U-boat onslaught on America began on January 12, 1942, when the SS Cyclops was torpedoed off of Cape Cod. In the following 2 months, over 1 million tons of Allied shipping was lost in American waters before a single German U-boat was sunk. America and our allies were so desperately short of patrol craft and escorts for convoys that throughout 1942 we would lose ships at an alarming rate. That's the role that Boston Navy Yard would play in replacing, building new escort craft. Destroyers and the more quickly built destroyer escorts would have been launched from the shipbuilding ways 1942 through 43 and 44. Throughout America in 1943, you would have seen the scales tipping towards the Allies as more ships, more aircraft, more tanks, more transports are being built, and millions of young men and women are being trained to serve their country. Boston was the 7th busiest port in the United States in 1941. By 1943, she's one of the busiest ports in the world, as every day dozens of ships enter and leave the port. Warships escorting convoys that had been passing from New York past New England on their way to Europe. Warships coming in for repairs from battle damage, or damage from collision or storm. Along the waterfront of downtown Boston, many of the coastwise steamers that would have connected Boston with Nantasket Beach and towns up in Maine would see these vessels taken by the Navy and used for escort, minesweepers, and sub-patrol. passing by in about 45 minutes.
Up here like a map, sir?
Thank you.
Map?
Thank you, sir.
Map, folks?
Nice. See? That's not.
We're now passing by Commonwealth Pier 5, that would have been the Navy storehouse. The adjacent wharf. The building with the brick arch facing out to the harbor. Flagpole rising above, the trucks on the wharf, that's the Boston Fish Pier.
Okay. I'm just curious. Thank you.
The oldest, busiest, biggest fish pier in the nation. Dozens of fishing vessels would have been tying up next to her at any given time throughout most of her history. During World War II, many New England fishermen, including those from Boston, lost their lives to German U-boats in the Gulf of Maine and in the high seas.
I didn't know this. The U-boats got all the way over here. We were attacking our... I had no idea from all the history I learned. Really? And they were attacking our boats.
We're now approaching
right over here.
the South Boston Naval Annex. An even larger component of Boston Navy Yard than Charlestown.
No, you're fine. That's what I'm
This section of the Navy Yard was purchased by the Navy and commissioned in 1919.
I didn't know
When you
that.
see the white tent, the county center today, just before that is dry dock number 4.
No.
This is where
The airlines, or the
large combatants would be
attacking them.
repaired.
World War I was the first real U-boat war. That was the first time that U-boats were
And the adjacent wars would have been
by the
ships
German army.
waiting
They
for
came here?
replenishment
World War I, they didn't come here.
for minor
There was
repairs and
one on Boston,
modifications.
Battle of Orleans.
Many ships that were built in Fall River Shipyard in Quincy and in
Germany
Haven
had very
and at the back iron works in Maine would come down to Boston and here to Boston, South Boston Naval Annex for completion.
Because it was nothing that we're used to.
120 ships were completed in Boston Navy Yard during the Second World War.
While we knew they could do it, we didn't have an effective way to counter it early in the war. Because early in the war, they were, as they prowled off the Atlantic coast, sinking at much.
So then on our right, where Legal Seafoods headquarters are today. You see cars parked.
So there's actually
And some modern warehouse buildings. There would have been 4 massive piers
all the sinkings of the U-boats to the different.
that would have stretched out from the large warehouse you see in the distance. These piers would have been 1,000 feet long. The area between the piers has been filled in today to create the industrial park that you see on our right. And looming behind the industrial park
Starting to recede further.
is dry dock number 3.
Mostly around the north.
You can see a ship that is undergoing repairs right now.
Well, you know, they had
One of the largest dry docks in the world. Certainly one of the largest dry docks on the east coast of the United States.
They had like women.
In the summer of 1943, the battleship USS Iowa, which had been launched
Even very early on.
just weeks earlier from the Brooklyn Navy Yard, had come into dry dock for emergency repairs, having run aground during her sea trials in Casa, Maine.
Congress is here.
The Navy Yard had to scrounge around the country
I'm not
for
sure
enough
if their
steel
corporate headquarters. They have
to make repairs to these massive battleships hull, shipping larger than the
pharmaceuticals as well.
ship you see in dry dock number 3 today. The Navy Yard was able to complete the work in less than a month's time.
Be able to develop capacity.
The space adjacent at the North Jetty, which we'll be passing by in just a moment, next to the warehouse with the building with the blue roof. We have had the newly commissioned USS Buffalo, an Essex-class carrier, built to the prison, ready like the Iowa to ship out to the Pacific. The two ocean war that the United States Navy was involved in was to be fought on a massive scale, but it could only be done so when the ships being built here in Massachusetts and elsewhere in the country were ready. So too, the millions of sailors that would be needed to prosecute the war. In South Boston, North Atlantic, there's a receiving band still standing there known as the Barnes Building, formerly known as the Farmer Building, that would have held 8,000 sailors at any one time, ready to go aboard the ships that were being built here in New England, commissioned in Boston, Navy Yard.
Well, I didn't know. What do those things do? Maybe he said it. I was blue and white things. Are those locked?
No, that's Conway shipping terminal. Those are really those pick up the shipping container, move them on and off the ship, the cargo boats.
Wow.
Delvin controls the dry docks because I've seen naval vessels in there, but I don't know if they actually still own them or not. Transferred the land to the city of Boston. So it's the Industrial Development Corporation that owns it now, and then General Ship, which is headquartered in Baltimore, operates the dry docks on the lease agreement. So they're owned by the city of Boston, operated by General Ship. So if the Navy needs to repair something, they leased by General Ship. So yep, the Navy will not repair combatants here, but they will repair United States naval ships, meaning hospital ships, tankers that'll have a civilian crew, but with naval officers on board. So they contract the general ship, right? General ship to do the work. Correct. Okay, thank you.
So as I'm leaving the Inner Harbor now, I'm going to be passing things on to my fellow ranger at Boston National Historical Park and formerly of Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, Tristan Healy. She'll be joined by Boston Harbor Island National State Park Ranger Tim Gill, who I failed to mention in my introduction, who's going to be sharing incredible stories about the Harbor Islands along with Tristan during the Second World War. I'll briefly rejoin the narrative to discuss the shipyard south of Boston as we pass their sites by. And then I'll be back here for closing remarks as we come back into the harbor around 1 o'clock.
That you see over on your right side of the ship. Now, Casa Island is actually the second fortification that you're going to be seeing on that location. The original location housed Castle William, which was used during the American Revolution. As for World War II, what Castle Island is going to be mostly used for is going to be used as a dowsing station. There was a joint operation with U.S. and British Navy. That it was operational in this area, where they would go in and use the tides to remove any magnetic charge that would come off from submarines that they thought that the German submarines were transmitting. Now, the actual headquarters for the is not here on Castle Island, but actually over on Pier 11, back in the Washington shipyard. Now, this was considered a top secret operation during the time, as we did not want Germany to know what was going on. The island itself is open today for visitors. As you can see, we have visitors over there currently. While it is not operated by the Park Service, it is operated by one of our partners, the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. At this time, what we're going to do is we're going to let you guys sit back and enjoy what you're looking at around the area. Our next location that we will be talking about will be in a few moments, and that will be about Pettis Island. Not the island in front of us, but it will be approaching us very shortly. Is the Alpino. They are just in for routine visits. I've found out that they actually were down in Baltimore just a few weeks ago as well. Now, if you guys are on the right-hand side of the ship right now, and you're looking at the water tower that you're going to see, the colored water tower.
Gas, actually.
Sorry, gas tank. Sorry. Yes. That is going to be over in Columbia Point area. Columbia Point, during World War II, you had Camp McKay. Camp McKay actually is where we had some German POWs. Now, you also did have some Italian POWs that were there for a short time that would actually end up being transferred over to Pettig's Island. And we'll be talking about why they were transferred over to Pettig's Island in just a few moments.
It's a very special role when it comes to World War II. The part of the island is Fort Strong is something we will talk about because we're going to be coming around to the other end of that island later in the tour. But right now, I'm going to tell you about a highly classified operation that took place at Pettig's Island, or Long Island was part of at the end of World War II. Throughout World War II, Germany was right here ahead of us in terms of technological development. They were responsible for the first jet-powered fighter in the world, Messerschmitt. They were also responsible for the first long-range missiles ever used in combat, the V-1 and the V-2 vengeance weapons that were used with devastating effect against Britain throughout World War II. So come the end of World War II, the Allies, the United States, Britain, and Soviet Russia, all wanted to get their hands on German scientists so they could help develop their own programs. It became more or less the start of the Cold War arms race. There was a race to find these scientists and recruit them to come work for your country. This became one part of this was what's known as Operation Paperclip. The Operation Paperclip was involving the rounding up of German scientists and eventually rounded up over 500 of them. Particularly, they were interested in scientists that worked in aerodynamics, rocketry, physics, chemical warfare, chemical reaction technology, and medicine. In 1946, the first 7 of those scientists were smuggled into the U.S., now housed at Fort Strong. Those 7 scientists, because of their affiliation with the Nazi Party and their work with the government of the Third Reich, they would not have been eligible to enter this country on an official visa. They were brought in without the review of the State Department, and they were housed there in great secrecy. One of the scientists that was brought in and housed there was probably one of the most famous of all of the German scientists brought to this country, none other than Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun was responsible for a lot of the technological development of rocketry in Nazi Germany. But when he came here, he was responsible for helping develop a lot of military rocket systems in the 50s and 60s. He was also part of the founding of NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, where once again his rocketry development was a long string of rockets that led to the rockets that did carry Apollo 11 to the moon in 1969. And that man was housed on Long Island at Fort Strong for a little while before he was moved on further into the military system where he worked for the United States government. Now I'm going to hang up. Our next stop we'll be talking to you in just a few minutes. I'll be at Pettig's Island, but we do let you enjoy the view.
There's actually going to be one island in the largest island in our harbor. It's actually also built on some of the most historical locations within our harbor. Pettig's Island not only has the military history to it, but it also has some phenomenal history with cultural resources, and also is the oldest archaeological site of Native American communities in this area. Pettig's Island, like many of the other islands, all the Native American communities in this area used to use it as their housing. It's open during the summer. Camping out there as an opportunity to learn more about the history of that island. Italian POWs over here. They're in walking distance when they're at Fort McKay. You can imagine the local community of Italian families coming and visiting these locations, trying to communicate with these men. And what happens is, even though about 6 months after they're in Fort McKay, Italy is going to surrender. We still want to try to keep everything separate. So what's going to take place is they're actually going to move the prisoners out here to Penix Island, just to try to keep them isolated a little bit so they can figure out what to do with these men. Now, as for the island itself, you have Fort Andrews, which is there. You have the men that have been stationed there, and their job is going to be pretty much monitoring what is going on. When the prisoners arrive, they also now have to make sure that the prisoners are going to be behaving. For the most part, the prisoners and the soldiers that were here did keep to themselves. They kept separate areas. But they were not the only inhabitants of the island at this time. If we're looking at the island right now ahead of us on our left front, we have on our far left one mound, one of our drum mounds. We have a center, we have a flat lying area, then we have our second drum on the right. The center area that you're seeing there, there's actually going to be cottages over there. And the cottages are summer homes from the former Portuguese fishing villages that used to be on Long Island that got relocated. So, a lot of times what happens is the soldiers then would go down, pick up the scraps, and use that as a weapon. That's not to say that these men were not being fed well. They're still getting their rations. There's an extra amount of food that they can provide. Now, as for their life while they're on island, they're going to be monitored and making sure they know what's going on. Now, what's going to happen eventually is they're going to monitor. If you're on good behavior, you're going to have more benefits than those who are wraparound. For those who are on good behavior, one of the benefits is actually going to be getting a weekend leave. You're allowed, under supervision, to go into the North End and have a nice Italian meal with one of the local families. It's said that because of this, there's actually about 50 of these men who were in prison here that end up marrying locals here in Boston. Now, as for their time when they're on island, another area that they would do is they'd have their downtime and they'd be playing different games. While we were playing baseball games as prisoners, we're not too much into baseball. As you can imagine, they're playing soccer. Now, the soldiers that are sitting there, they're watching them and they see that this is an acceptable one game. Now, some of them do try to join in, but for the most part, they're going to keep to themselves. We'll be talking a little bit more about their interactions on their return. Ranger Tim is also going to be talking a little bit more about the fortification that is over on Penix Island on Fort Andrews when we cycle back around. What we're going to be doing right now is we're going to be continuing on our way towards Hingham and towards Grape Island and Bumpkin Island, where Ranger David is going to be telling us a little bit more about what took place over on these locations.
Down the mouth of the Fall River, and shortly you'll be able to see the light towers that still rise above the former shipyard. It was the headquarters of Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding. Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding was established in 1913. The company, based in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, purchased the Fall River Ship and Engine Company that had been established at Quincy Point in 1901. In 1940, there were 3 shipyards on the east coast of the United States known as the Big Three. These were the 3 shipyards in America that could build any type of ship that the Navy required. Of the Big Three, Quincy was number 1. And this shipyard idea who's done something wrong on this ship. That's the third time we've been buzzed by the state police, so you better jump off now and swim to shore. Anyways, with that said, the Fall River Shipyard in Quincy was in operations until 1986, and many folks aboard of a certain age remember Goliath, the crane that would rise above the shipyard. A full 20 stories was used to build the LNG tankers which still sail into Boston today. Fall River Shipyard would have had a workforce of over 32,000 during the Second World War, and of those about 1,500 were women workers. Those are riveters, as they would be called in some industries, but in shipyards they would have been termed winded welders. Fall River Shipyard would launch 97 ships for the Navy during the Second World War, including the battleship Massachusetts, which is today the War Memorial in Fall River, Massachusetts, that I encourage you to visit if you haven't been down there. It's a remarkable vessel. In addition to the battleship Massachusetts, 5 Essex-class carriers were launched and underway before the end of the Second World War. Another 3 were in their building stages, but Japan surrendered in 1945. There were 13 heavy or light cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 18 destroyer escorts launched in Quincy during the Second World War. It actually would account for the largest amount of shipping tonnage launched in any single shipyard in the United States. Like the Boston Navy Yard and the upcoming Hingham Shipyard, which we'll be passing by the side of in just a few minutes, these shipyards would have been employing thousands of workers who engaged in labor, heavy labor, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. To give an idea of how complex ship construction is, I encourage you to visit USS Casa, the destroyer that's tied up at Pier 1 when we return to the Charlestown Navy Yard. Just imagine that is one of the smaller combatants our Navy would have. Imagine all the work that it would take to build an aircraft carrier in the 1940s. When American labor was at its best, its resources in abundance, but still, the dozens of shipyards that have been opened up across the country, competition was fierce for steel, for brass, aluminum, copper. And considering that we were sending hundreds of thousands of young sailors and Marines into harm's way, construction of these vessels had to be done perfectly in order to bring these boys back home. They're carrying the most advanced technology of any Navy in the world. Computers aboard ships fabricated down in New York were transported up to Boston and elsewhere through the country that would give us the technological advantage over the German and Japanese navies. Here in Boston, second only to the Manhattan Project in defense spending, was the top secret program based at MIT, just a mile down the Charles River from Boston Navy Yard. That is where radar is being developed, microwave radar, for the Allied navies, armies, and air forces of the world. Many of the ships that were leaving from Boston Navy Yard, Fall River Shipyard, and Hingham Shipyard at Hewitt's Cove would have been carrying the radar systems, in some cases, for experimental use in Massachusetts Bay. So too, experimental radar would be mounted in aircraft and blimps flying out of the 2 naval air stations south of Boston, the Squantum Naval Air Station in Quincy and the South Weymouth Naval Air Station, just a few miles west of us. Because of the urgent need for escorts for convoys across the Atlantic and for anti-submarine warfare, the United States Navy tasked Boston Navy Yard with building the first destroyer escorts in the world. These ships today would be referred to as frigates, just like the Italian ship we passed by earlier. They were designed to kill enemy submarines, shoot down enemy aircraft, to protect the convoys that are carrying the much-needed supplies to our allies in Europe. The Bethlehem Steel Shipyard in Hingham opened up in the early months of 1942. You would have another massive workforce of over 25,000, including 1,800 female workers. That would have, on average, by 1943, been launching over six ships a month. In fact, even though they were minor combatants, Hingham has the record of launching more hulls than any other single shipyard in the United States during World War II. These were much smaller vessels than battleships or aircraft carriers, but destroyers and destroyer escorts were known as the workhorses of the fleet. In addition to protecting convoys and hunting enemy submarines, they were the outer wing of defense, protecting the cruisers, battleships, and aircraft carriers that were prosecuting the war in the Atlantic and Pacific. The pride of the workers in Boston, Quincy, and Hingham, and shipyards across the United States could be seen at every launching. By the end of 1943, American shipyards had replaced all of the merchant shipping tonnage lost in the war since 1949. And the American Navy has grown to become the strongest and most powerful in the world, and we've never looked back. I'll be turning things over now to Tim and Tristan, and I'll see you when we get back into Boston Harbor.
Camp on that island is open to visitation from June 22nd through Columbus Day. But during World War II, this island was still very active after World War I. It was idle, no defenses, no active defense, but that didn't mean they stopped growing, stopped training. Bumpkin Island was home to a naval training academy. The details of what was at that training academy are scarce. I haven't been able to find them, so I'm not entirely sure what was there. But I can tell you throughout the harbor, post-World War I, the harbor did continue to evolve and change and update its defenses. Like any army, like any military, it saw what it did right during the First World War, it saw what it did wrong, and took advantage of new technologies and solved it, and its testing proved accurate, and it trained its soldiers. There were training schools throughout the harbor islands, throughout the different fortifications and defenses. One example of that would be Hedix Island, which is directly ahead of us. Hedix Island had training schools as well. And like all these harbor defenses, there were men on them as early as September of 1940s, preparing the garrisons in what they thought was nearly the inevitability of an upcoming conflict. So they would train daily on these islands, on big guns, on the minefields, on the anti-aircraft guns, on the mortar batteries, training and drilling. There were also schools on these islands for gunnery, infantry tactics, field operations, signals communications. Every skill set you can imagine was needed to train these men. When war finally did break out, in late 1941, like the outset of every war throughout history, experienced personnel, experienced soldiers became worth their weight in gold. The more experienced soldiers you had, the better. And you didn't need those experienced personnel and soldiers manning back line stations, manning coastal defenses where there were chances of action, but not very likely compared to the frontline units. You needed those soldiers that had that experience, had that training to go forward to the front lines. So the units that were in this harbor, particularly the 241st Coastal Artillery Battalion, Harbor Defense, which was Massachusetts National Guard, which had trained on a lot of these guns, as well as the 9th Coastal Artillery Regiment, which was regular Army. After the outset of war, these experienced men were parsed out throughout the Army and Navy, and they were sent to overseas units where they could use their experience in combat, and they could use their experience training that they earned here in this harbor to train other soldiers. So it made the frontline units more effective. They would then ship in replacements to places such as Fort Andrews directly in front of us on Petix Island, where then they could train in the relative safety of a coastal defense. At least relative compared to what the soldiers were facing on the front lines in Asia, the Pacific, the Philippines, North Africa, Italy, and eventually the continent of Europe itself. I've got a little more to say about Fort Strong, but we'll wait a few more minutes until we come in view of more of the buildings. They built brick buildings you are seeing directly in front of this ship are that buildings that were original to Fort Andrews. Fort Andrews was constructed starting in 1898, so these are some of the original buildings from that fort. Petix Island is open to camping and visitation throughout the summer starting in June 22nd. As Tristan mentioned earlier, it has some of the most historic buildings, some of the coolest stories. Searchlights to search for incoming anti-aircraft, incoming vessels. But it also had mortar batteries. Mortars were special because they were protected in concrete bunkers situated behind hillsides, highly protected, and then they could fire up and over and out for a range of about 14,000 yards. Now I will, spoiler alert, no guns in the Boston Harbor were ever used in warfare. They were never fired against an enemy here. But Fort Andrews holds a special place because it did contribute to an act of defense. Because there were originally 16 12-inch mortars that were placed in 2 batteries on Fort Andrews in the early 1900s. After the Spanish-American War, the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy began fortifying a small series of islands off the coast of Manila Bay in the Philippines called Corregidor. In the fortification of that island, they needed artillery, so they took 4 of the 12-inch mortars from Fort Andrews. They shipped them to the Philippines. They were installed in Battery Geary on Fort Mills, which is the largest of the fortified islands of Corregidor. Battery Geary and those 4 mortars, along with others that were shipped in from other places, were used in the active defense of Corregidor Island at the outset of World War II against the Japanese Army. They were used actively in that defense. They took a high toll in the Japanese Army, but they did eventually fall along with the rest of the island. So it is a unique story because some of the guns that were originally placed here were used in defense of an island during World War II. And if you make your way to Corregidor, to Fort Mills, it is open for visitation and tourism. You can actually see the 4 mortars of the Petix mortar batteries still in battery at Fort Mills on Corregidor to this day. You can see pictures of them online as well. So that Fort Andrews went on through active service all the way through the end of the war. The Italian prisoners of war. It was decommissioned in 1948. One other thing it did do throughout the war is it trained soldiers in chemical warfare. It trained them how to protect themselves against chemical warfare and all the arts, not necessarily to wage chemical warfare, but to resist it. Chemical warfare was something that was used throughout World War I, so they thought it might be something that could be used extensively again during World War II as well. So it's important to train these soldiers to be able to fight and counteract attacks. Now when I come back with you in just a few minutes, I'm going to talk about the only time that the harbor defenses were breached right after the outset of World War II, and we'll be back with you in just a few minutes. Below the surface. command post, which is on Fort Dawes, Deer Island. The Harbor Island defenses went on high alert. It wasn't too long after Pearl Harbor, so you can understand they were a little anxious whenever they detected an infiltration. Searchlights on Fort Warren and the surrounding islands scanned the harbor, looking for a ship. There was no sign of any surface vessel. At the same time, a call to District Naval Intelligence revealed that there were no Allied submarines within 200 miles of Boston Harbor. At the same time, listening stations at Fort Warren could track the sound of underwater propellers navigating this top-secret minefield. They were tracking it. This vessel was maneuvering entirely through this top-secret minefield and into Boston Harbor. Gun batteries at Fort Warren, Fort Standish on Lovell's Island, and others throughout the harbor were trained on this location, looking for a periscope to break the surface. They saw nothing. But as this vessel continued to track through their newly laid minefield, it made contact with one of these mines. Now, these mines weren't contact mines. These were mines that were detonated remotely because you couldn't put contact mines in Boston Harbor without shutting down the harbor entirely. It made contact with one of these mines and set off an alarm in the mine control rooms at Fort Warren. As quickly as this had happened, though, that vessel retreated out of that minefield. The order to fire those mines or to open fire with big batteries was never given. The reason being that they actually wanted to try and trap and capture that vessel, which was presumed to be a German submarine, because they're the ones that had the capabilities. They wanted to try and trap it, figure out where this new vessel had figured out the intelligence to pass through this top secret minefield. They wanted to know, was it leaked? Did they have a spy? Where did they get this information? This was the first time and only time that Boston Harbor defenses came anywhere close to engaging an enemy vessel since the time of the Revolutionary War. It was something that was kept top secret by the United States Navy. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure how much of it is declassified even to this day officially, but enough of the information exists that we can put the story together. Understandable that they wanted to keep it top secret that a German submarine had penetrated the top secret defenses of one of the busiest ports in the country less than 6 months after the attack at Pearl Harbor.
With the wind turbine, they had some of these 10-inch versions, so they're smaller. But the thing about these guns is when they're on that island here, and even when they're over in Hull, the people in the town were complaining from these weapons was so strong that it could literally shatter windows. So you have to imagine what's going through these guys and what effects it had on them. As for the mines that are here in the harbor, not only are you going to be having the mines in the submarine that's lining between here and Levels, which is now on our side, you also are going to have searchlights allowing you to see what ships are coming in and out. You have a 60-inch searchlight over on George's Island that's watching where we're passing right now. You have the mines that are running in the harbor, looking for subs, just like Ranger Tim was talking about a few moments ago. Over here on Mobile's Island, you're going to have a couple bunkers very similar to what was over on Pettix. And the island directly in front of us right now is Gallops Island. Gallops Island is also another location that's going to house some of our military history during World War II. While Gallops Island is not open to the public today, like George's Island and Lovell's Island, Gallops Island was actually going to be housing a radio school on this island. Now, the thing about the radio school that you have,
That's what's going like. That's where the execution.
you have so many of these young officers who are chosen to attend the school. And just like so many of the other officers that were around, such as on Bumpkin Island and on Grave Island, it is some of these men that are handpicked to go serve on the front lines when needed. So while they had specific jobs they were trained for, when they went out to go fight, they don't always were doing that one job.
There's some like old daycare store, but if you're going to Boston Harbor, back to the first thing you see out there, it's some bodies might be on display for back with 4 years Charlestown, and passed a slave who had been executed 20 years before, whose body was still on display.
Just as another point of reference for you guys, another little tidbit of history for Gallops Island.
Public executions were addicted, just like in London.
During the Civil War, it is also going to be a mustering in and out station for soldiers. It is actually where you have the Massachusetts 54th, the Massachusetts 55th Colored Infantry, and the Massachusetts 5th Colored Cavalry returning to port before returning to Boston.
Between the high tide and the low tide. Essentially, they're executed under Admiralty law, and the Admiralty law sea essentially only extended as far as high tide. They're buried, usually the bodies are completely washed by usually 3 successive tides, then buried in unconsecrated ground. Now, allegedly, one of the pirate bodies, a guy called John Lambert, was stolen away from his son and is buried by King's Chapel in downtown Boston. Because the son and the wife is buried there, and the belief is that the man himself, John Lambert, who was executed for piracy, he was among the first group under a guy called John Quelch actually executed. Because originally pirates arrested here could not be executed within the New World. They had to be executed back in. A good example is Captain Kidd. Okay. So Captain Kidd is in solitary confinement for Boston for almost a whole year before he goes to London for trial. And actually, evidence that could have exonerated him was kept hidden from the court. It was only refound a few decades back. So he's actually executed on execution dock.
What time was that? That was like
1690s is going to be Captain Kidd. It's really just before kind of the golden age of piracy. And then really starting after the 1715, you can see this explosion of piracy in the New World because of an end of a major war, the War of the Spanish Succession. And so that's when guys like Black Sam Bellamy, now he's not well known, but he was probably the most popular, famous pirate of his day. His is the only pirate treasure that's actually ever been recovered off the coast of Cape Cod. If you go down to Yarmouth and Cape Cod, you can see that pirate treasure on display. They found the remains of his ship, the WWII Galley. Though his flagship, the WWII Galley, and another ship were both shipwrecked off Cape Cod. Only a few men survived. They were taken from Cape Cod to Boston and tried there. Blackbeard threatened that if they were executed, he would blockade Boston Harbor. Now, the threat never comes to pass. He later on, though, blockades Charleston, South Carolina. He prevents any ships coming in and going out. The only ransom was actually what he demanded. It wasn't treasure. It was actually medicine, probably to treat, unfortunately, venereal disease. So that being said, only a few men were spared
from execution. One was a Mosquito Indian called John Julian, who ends up becoming the slave of John Quincy, the grandfather of John Quincy Adams.
All right, guys. So as we make our way around Gallops Island and begin our return back, one thing that we were talking about earlier were those soccer matches over on Peddix Island, and what happened with the downtime for the men.
That you could extract from the
Now,
that's what actually a lot of pirates.
each of our islands are going to have their own little bit of downtime.
Commodities, cotton, tobacco, timber.
As I mentioned, baseball is going to be one of our biggest downtimes that soldiers were allowed to do. They were playing baseball games actually between the different islands at times. They'd have different little competitions. George's Island had their own baseball team. They would play against Peddix Island. They would play against Gallops Island. They would play against Lovell's Island. However, that's not their only form of entertainment. Specifically on George's Island, we have accounts of some of these activities. George's Island is going to have a single-lane bowling alley for the men. There is also a movie theater that is going to be able to be put up temporarily in one of the casements. And by far, my favorite out of all these is about once a month, you would have the Narragansett Company come out and sponsor an event for the men. Of course, you have to know that the officers love this because it allowed them to keep track of their men a little bit easier. Now, in addition to this, you did have concerts, you did have recreation halls that were on these islands allowing men to have some downtime. One of the other forms of recreation and competition between the islands was boxing matches. There's accounts of boxing matches between all of our islands. We also have accounts not only during World War II, but in some of the previous wars where you had soldiers that were located on these islands, of members of professional baseball teams coming out to play scrimmages against some of these men that were stationed here. Now, while everything was going on here, it is very serious business. They want to have their downtime. But for those back on the home front, back in Maine, Boston, in Charlestown, they're going to be having their own war efforts and trying to help out as well. We'll be talking a little bit more about their efforts in just a little bit.
Be sailing into the big guns of Fort Strong. Fort Strong had disappearing rifles just like a lot of our harbor defenses. But by 1942, 1943, it's realizing that those guns are mostly outdated, mostly obsolete, because the threat is from aircraft and submarines. Fort Strong has rapid fire guns, which could work on surface vessels, but also a unique defense that was in a lot of ports and harbors, strung between the head of Long Island and Deer Island, off to our front right, where the giant eggs are for Massachusetts wastewater distribution. That's Deer Island. That would have been Fort Dawes, the headquarters of the Harbor Defense of Boston. Strung in this channel would have been a defense of a torpedo net and an anti-motorboat boom. Now, the motorboat boom was interesting because in World War I and early World War II, there was tremendous success of in different parts of the world of small, low draft, high speed wooden boats penetrating highly defended harbors, past minefields, past nets, being able to attack and sometimes sink vessels and otherwise secure anchorages. So they strung a boom across harbors that essentially consisted of a wooden box that had two metal tanks in the middle for flotation, and long iron pikes and spikes on the edges of these boxes, as well as on the cables between the boxes, meant to tear into the hulls of these wooden boats and stop them dead in their tracks. The boxes were very heavy, but these booms were only effective against this specific type of attack. The Army Ordnance Manual even specifically states that it is no good against metal-hulled vessels, landing craft that are properly protected propellers, anything larger, it was entirely ineffective. They weren't too worried about that though, because there were enough other heavy defenses throughout the harbor. The vessel like that would be easily spotted. The motorboats relied on speed and darkness to penetrate the harbor. Additionally, this had a torpedo net that was strung between the different sections of the boom as well as below it. The torpedo net was up to 40 feet deep. It was made of iron rings similar to mesh or chainmail, if you're familiar with that. That is large iron rings that are interwoven together, meant to not so much to stop the torpedo cold, but to arrest it, to catch its momentum, stop it while it was underwater. And after the attack of Pearl Harbor, where they realized that there was now a capability for torpedoes dropped from aircraft to skim the surface, they modified the design of the nets so that they were now extended above surface to stop that particular type of attack. That's one example of the Army learning from failures and learning from mistakes and adapting to change. Now, this was not an anti-submarine net as you would expect, but they didn't need an anti-submarine net here. The Army Ordnance Manual goes on to say that in shallow waters, such as here, where the channel is approximately 65 feet deep, an anti-torpedo net was a very effective defense against submarines as well, because a submarine could not possibly dive deep enough to totally avoid the net. So at the very least, its superstructure, the upper part of it, if not its main body, would get caught up in that net. It might break through the net, but not without certainly giving indication that it was there and allowing the defenders to respond. So a submarine, it was very unlikely that a submarine could pass through these defenses without notice and sneak into inner Boston Harbor. This was all in place by about 1943, so it was not in place during the time of the infiltration in 1942. That would effectively seal Boston Harbor. They had a way to deal with that, though. They actually installed a gate in the middle of that. That was operated by a special vessel that was actually able to handle the chains and the netting, the torpedo net and the boom, and actually was able to disconnect it and float that gate open to allow traffic during certain periods of the day to pass in and out of the harbor, allowing all those ships that were being constructed in these shipyards to pass out, and allowing Allied vessels and small civilian fishermen and commercial boats to pass in and out of Boston Harbor. This vessel also would have been equipped with monitoring devices, so it could monitor for any submarines that might potentially try and slip through the net while that net was open, as well as defenses against anti-aircraft. If the net was attacked, this vessel could attempt to defend itself if they needed to close the net during an assault. Now we're passing Deer Island off to our right now. Deer Island was the other end of this. Deer Island was home to Fort Dawes, and before World War II started, it was designated as the future home for the command of the entire harbor defenses of Boston. It became known as the Harbor Entrance Control Post. This gave it a lot of special equipment. By the end of the war, it had advanced signaling and communications gear, 90mm rapid-fire guns, anti-aircraft batteries, 6 and 3-inch, 16 and 6-inch disappearing rifles for long-range defense. And after World War II, at the very end of World War II, it also had radar, traditional radar as well as experimental radar that was being developed by the boys at MIT, used by the Allied Navy. So every harbor island defense, everything that happened was communicated and coordinated to the structures on the highly guarded part of Fort Dawes on Deer Island. cities all over this country. We need defense workers in aircraft factories, automobile plants that have been converted over to building troop transports and tanks, and shipyards like those in Fall River, Hingham, and Charlestown. When we reflect upon the greatest generation that fought in the greatest war this world has ever known, and God willing will ever know, we'll have to pause for a moment and remember their incredible sacrifices. Today the harbor is filled with pleasure craft, a few cruise ships, of course the Italian Navy vessel and the Portuguese training ship that you might have seen sailing in behind us. Once again, the wars would have been filled with shipping, carrying goods to keep our allies, the British and Russians, in the war. German armies that were roughshod every year. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. In 1941, German armies approached so close to Moscow that they could see the spires of the city. Across the Pacific, Japanese military were building defensive rings of air bases and naval stations on dozens and dozens of islands that they had captured throughout the Pacific. Under their control was nearly a third of the world's population. They had all the resources that they needed to stand independently and prosecute war alone. They had oil reserves, rubber plantations, the raw materials to make steel and aluminum for ship and aircraft production. The Battle of the Atlantic was nearly lost by the Allies in early 1943. But 1943 was the year that everything would begin to change. The Russians had captured a huge German army after the defense of Stalingrad, where hundreds of thousands lost their lives. Allied armies from America, Canada, Great Britain have liberated Africa. They've stepped off to invade Sicily and have begun the invasion of Italy. By late 1943, the writing was on the wall as more warships, troops transports, landing craft were being produced in American shipyards. The invasion of Europe for 1944 would happen. In the Pacific, there were gains as our Navy landed Marines on far-off islands, and these young men fought like hell to regain lost territory. In the bloody campaign for the island of Tara in November 1943, thousands of young sailors and Marines lost their lives in the first American thrust across the Central Pacific and toward the home islands of Japan. Despite the successes of 1943, the Allies knew that they were in for a tough fight in 1944. If it wasn't for the ships built here in Massachusetts and elsewhere in the country, troops could not be transported to far-off islands or landed on the beaches of Europe in 1944. German submarines would have sailed off the Atlantic. The United States would no longer be able to send support to Great Britain and Russia, and their armies would fail. If it weren't for our Navy, there would have been no liberation of Europe. There would have been no landing of Army troops on the beaches of Normandy in June of 1944. When we think of the contributions that Massachusetts made to the war effort, they're one of the smallest states in the Union. For industries, for colleges and universities, played a major role in winning the